I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
So today we have Benjamin Studebaker. He's a political theorist, and we want to talk to him about his most recent book, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, which was published by Edinburgh University Press just this year, or actually now last year, but barely, 2024. He's also the author of The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, which I think is a very descriptive title, and that was published the year before by Palgrave in 2023. I'd just ask you to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit further, though, Benjamin, and maybe give us, something that some information that's important to you, or your diatribe, because one of the things that we sometimes ask our interviewees to do is, give us your diatribe. So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I originally come from Indiana. I went to ordinary state high schools in the United States. Then for undergrad, I went to the University of Warwick in the UK, because by the time I got to the end of high school, I knew I just wanted to do politics. I didn't want to have to do all of these other subjects. I knew what I wanted to do. So I went to Warwick. I did my undergraduate degree there. Then I went back to the United States to University of Chicago for my master's. I thought maybe I missed out on something about going to school in the United States. I want to know something about what that's like. So I did that. And what I found at Chicago is that a lot of the people who had done undergrad in the United States had another year of schooling than me, but they had read less things than I had read, simply because of the school that they went to and what was assigned and the expectations. So for the PhD, I decided I'd like to go back to the UK, and I went to Cambridge and did the PhD there. I finished that up in 2020. I studied under David Runciman. He was my supervisor out there. And since then, I've gone into writing books. I've done a couple of books. I have been out of the institutions a little bit. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm independent, because all of this stuff has in some way made me what I am. I wouldn't be what I am without all of these experiences that I've had, without my family, and without going through those universities. As much as I may sometimes get frustrated with the universities, they are a part of me, and they always will be a part of me. And even insofar as I get outside of them, it will always be in some way shaped by whatever it is that they did to me. But I am currently doing a lot of my stuff with Theory Underground, which is focused on thinking about the conditions of possibility for theory at a time when universities are increasingly neglecting it or handling it in a kind of overly dogmatic way, focusing too much on telling people what to think rather than helping people figure out how to think about the things that matter to them. So that's been where my focus has tended to be recently. And I think you see some of that in terms of this new book and its emphases. I try very hard in this book not to be one of those theorists who tells everybody what to think all the time. I think people are tired of that. I don't think that's helping. So I've tried to get away from it a little bit.
Is that your diatribe? Go ahead, Spencer. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add, and haven't you also replaced Ashley Frawley on Sublation Media?
Oh, yes, I do a couple of podcasts a month with Doug Lane for Sublation. Though there are a number of other people who are also filling that role. It wouldn't just be me. There are a few other people who are also doing some of the things that Ashley used to do for them.
So let's get into the topic of your book. It's on legitimacy. It sounds like, I haven't read the previous book, but it sounds like that was kind of in the same zone. Did the first one kind of lay the platform for the second one? And why did you write this second book on legitimacy?
Yeah, my PhD at Cambridge was on legitimacy and inequality, and very much focused on, as economic inequality rises, does this cause legitimation problems in democracies? And if so, what are the nature of those problems? The first book that I wrote was very much focused on the United States, and it was very much focused on what is actually going on in the United States and how these changes are affecting different political movements, how they're affecting different classes of people in society, the stress that it creates, and the different kinds of responses that are available to people as they are subjected to this stress. The second book is more at the level of theory, and it's more focused on legitimacy itself and on how this process of legitimating states changes when you're in a political system that has been around a very, very long time, that people have a hard time imagining replacing with anything else.
So to sort of like square away what we're talking about for folks that may not be like attuned to the language, how would you define legitimacy? And then maybe talk a little bit about what is it, why is it important that a regime, be in existence for quite a while? What does that actually matter? And I think of the United States as a little bit on the young side, but I guess for a liberal democracy, it's not. But anyway, how would you define legitimacy?
Yeah, so legitimacy is to do with whether people accept the system of government, maybe even whether they endorse it. Though if they're not willing to endorse it, you might be able to settle for their acceptance of it or their even reluctant tolerance of it. So historically, in older theories of legitimacy from the Cold War, the assumption is that if you lose legitimacy, then there's going to be a revolution or a revolt, this kind of acute moment where there's a showdown between the state and the people who disagree with it. And the state will either repress those people, or it will make concessions to them, or they will overcome it and revolutionize it in some way. So legitimacy tends to historically be thought of in this very binary way. Either you have it or you don't have it. And if you don't have it, then there's going to be a big, big mess that's potentially violent, potentially dangerous, threatening to order, threatening to many people's basic values, but also potentially an opportunity for people who have very different values to see those values realized politically. And so those moments can be seen from both of those points of view, the point of view of wanting to preserve order, peace, stability, and also the point of view of wanting to change things in some radical way to bring about new values, new possibilities that the previous system was in some way blocking, repressing, preventing. In my work, I focus on how legitimacy has changed in this context where when people are disappointed with government, they don't necessarily assume that they can do something that will revolutionize it. They think about the history of attempts that have been made to revolutionize these liberal democracies. They think about things like the Russian Revolution. They think about things like the Soviet Union or Adolf Hitler, fascism, Mussolini, Maoism, and they look at these alternatives that were thrown up over the course of the 20th century, and they go, I don't want things to turn out like that. And because they don't want things to turn out like that, when they experience dysfunction, they tend to frame these as perhaps inconveniences that they have to put up with, or they look for ways that they can reform or tinker with the procedural schema of their democracies to make them a little bit more functional or a little bit purer. They talk about a process of democratization, of making the system more democratic. And they do this in part because they think that if they undertake some kind of major revolutionary effort, that it will just blow up in their face in some way, shape, or form, that they will put themselves in danger, they may get themselves killed, and what will they potentially accomplish? So in this situation where a legitimacy crisis doesn't necessarily mean that people will engage in revolutionary activity, it seems that legitimacy doesn't have the same stakes it used to have. It's not as necessary for the government to generate legitimacy because it isn't subjected to this threat of revolution or revolt. And yet, it is the case that many, many people have been deeply disappointed with the way the system works. They're very frustrated with the system. It's not as if they don't have criticisms of it. They just don't see a way of actualizing those criticisms of the kind or of the order that people would have been attracted to in, say, the middle or early part of the 20th century. And so a lot of the book is about, well, what do you do if you are dissatisfied with your institutions, but also there are these hard limits on how far you're willing to go? And what are the consequences of that for the system if you go through a very, very prolonged period of that? And I think that one of the key things that happens is that we get a level of disagreement in society that we previously could not have had. At earlier points where there were real alternatives that seemed to exist, once disagreement popped up, people would engage in various kinds of revolutionary activity. There would be some kind of showdown, and then those disagreements would be in some way dealt with. They wouldn't necessarily be permanently resolved, but there would be some kind of concession, repression, or overcoming that would occur that would in some way bring an end to that period of disagreement, that round of it. Without those possibilities, the disagreement can embed and get very, very deep into society, and it can affect more and more and more areas of life. And I think a lot of the time theorists have treated this as a kind of postmodernism, and sometimes this is treated as something transhistorical that we've only recently discovered. But I think it's something that's been produced by this fading away of revolutionary possibility, and by therefore there being no mechanism in politics to draw a line under these periods of quite extensive disagreement. And a lot of my theory is about that, about what happens when you get very, very deep disagreement that doesn't produce violence, doesn't produce revolutions of the kind that we used to see.
And is this what you mean by the concept of deep pluralism? And if so, could you also give like a few concrete examples of how that plays out when we can't have this showdown with society and instead it just gets like submerged?
Yeah, deep pluralism makes it such that if you try to get together with people in your community to do something, all sorts of disagreements pop up at very early stages in the organizing process that tend to very much frustrate what you're able to do. And these disagreements seem to come from, many different issues in areas of life that might not be immediately germane to what you're trying to do in your organizing activity. So I think this is something that we see in all of the different parts of the political spectrum, the left, the right, the center, that there's a lot of kind of popular front energy where people will try to put together a coalition of allied groups, but these groups will have deep disagreements about quite profound and significant and important things. And during a campaign, these disagreements can be put to one side. But if somebody wins an election and then they have to do something, all of a sudden, all of these disagreements become extremely, extremely visible, and the government has a very difficult time maintaining its popularity. So in the case of, say, American presidential politics, I think what we've seen now for several presidents in a row is this tendency for the president to, in the first year of the first term, come out with a set of concrete policies. In the case of Biden, it was the Build Back Better plan, the Human Infrastructure Plan. In the case of Trump, it was things like repealing and replacing Obamacare and the tax cuts. In the case of Obama, it was things like the stimulus package and the Affordable Care Act. And as soon as the vague, nebulous hope or change, the vague, nebulous, the forgotten people will not be forgotten anymore, becomes something specific, it's revealed that there's enormous disagreement within not just the opposition, not just between the president and the opposition party, but within the president's own party and ostensibly within their own movement about those specific policies. And so the president's approval rating, as soon as there's anything that's proposed, begins declining, such that by the time you get around to the midterm election, it's very, very likely that the president will lose a significant number of seats just because they have concretized the hope or the promise that they've made. And there's no way of concretizing the hope or the promise that will actually maintain the unity of the coalition. Oftentimes, the coalition is formed negatively because of dissatisfaction with whatever it is the previous president is associated with having done. So it's very, very difficult to produce any kind of positive consensus in any area of life, in any area of politics. And this also affects not just politics, but also social organizing, families. People are very, very quick to discover that they have irreconcilable differences when they're dating other people, when they get together with people in social clubs. And so all of these organizations are less able to take decisions, and they dissolve more rapidly the more they try to do. They split and fracture and fragment when they try to be more effective. And so to stay together, they have to have very, very low horizons, very minimal goals for themselves so that these disagreements don't flare up. And they tend to become talking shops where conversations are had, but very little is done, because as soon as you start doing things, these disagreements will appear.
Yeah, what I'm hearing kind of underlies this malaise is fear, like that it all comes back to fear of going into that zone of revolution, right? And based on history, people think, oh my God, that's like a bridge too far. We can't imagine changing regimes, and we don't want to come anywhere close to that. So because of that, we've gotten into, am I right about that? First of all, it's basically fear-based.
Yes, and there's a tendency to start equating at a very early stage things people are positively proposing to do with fascism or communism, even when these things are very, very, very far away from something comprehensive like that, to the point where if you propose to reform the healthcare system, this is framed as a communist takeover of the healthcare sector. Or if you propose to reform the administrative state, this is framed as a fascist takeover of the intelligence services or of the bureaucracy. Very, very quickly, opposition is framed in terms of this is a threat to democracy. This is an authoritarian project. And this happens at a very early stage. And yet, nonetheless, this is often very effective because of the degree to which these things are feared.
There seems to be such a memory, such an ingrained memory of the 20th century, conflicts, the big events of the 20th century, that even now, people who weren't even alive during that period of time are just continually going back to that point, that pivotal point. Maybe because it was, the events were huge, they were very large, catastrophic in nature, but it has always seemed really strange to me that even people who weren't anywhere even remotely alive during that period of time will go off to say, oh, like that's going to lead to totalitarian communism. And it almost seems like I don't know how conscious of a strategy is. Would you say that's a conscious strategy on the part of leadership in both parties in the United States, for instance, to kind of like remind people of these catastrophic events to kind of keep them from loosing their imagination a little bit?
I hesitate to make claims about the intentions of particular people or what level they're conscious of all of this. But I do think that there's a lot of things in our culture that serve as reminders of these things. A lot of movies and video games, which on the one hand are often very violent and framed as, potentially upsetting for that reason, but also have this function of reminding people of the violence of the past, of the 20th century. I think that that plays a very large role. And also, other states are framed often as still being in some way connected to those 20th century projects. States like the People's Republic of China or North Korea or the Russian Federation are framed as still being, in some sense, communist or fascist, and then held up as examples of what you mustn't do or what you might be trying to become. So there's still a lot of Red Scare energy in relation to these states and accusations that people in liberal democratic politics have some kind of allegiance or some sort of goal of making their state more like those states. Even though the Cold War is long over and all of these states are in the World Trade Organization for the most part.
But isn't part of your argument too, so yes, on the macro level, Trump is a fascist and Biden and Kamala are communist is how this thing breaks down. But also, recently Derek Varn went on Doug Lane's show and basically said a lot of people on the online left view Doug as a fascist. So there's also this thing at like the micro level where these fractures also exist, where like, I don't know how you can look at Douglas Lane and think that he's a fascist. But I guess, can you speak to that level of deep pluralism?
Yeah, one of the things that happens is that we get this kind of Red Scare style language where if you are someone who isn't opposing the fascism, then you are a useful idiot for the fascism, or you are a fellow traveler of the fascists. And the gradations that were used in the Red Scare and in the Cold War come back in various ways to try to position various people as carriers of a contagion of authoritarianism. And I think that this is something that we see at the organizational level in all sorts of social organizations, where very quickly there's some kind of language that's developed to accuse somebody else of being authoritarian. Even in family relationships, even in church communities, at very, very small scale levels, this kind of fracturing and these accusations of somebody's trying to develop a cult, somebody's trying to do something authoritarian immediately issue, especially if the organization tries to move in a concrete direction and take positive action. That positive action is mistrusted. And I think a lot of it is a mistrust of human beings, of the capacity of human beings to do things.
I would agree with that. I think we lack imagination right now. We're very, very stuck in a groove. So, that part of the book really resonated with me. And it helps explain some of the, I almost perceive it as just weird or surreal, like water treading that people are doing right now. And I heard you say that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that various sort of anti-liberal or, critiques of liberalism that you do see online coming from the left or the right tend to turn into talking shops more than action shops. I was watching, somehow I got on my feed the other day, the Communist Party USA come up with about an hour-long discussion of, taking action. And they had that criticism. They more or less were saying, we are actually trying to organize. I don't know how seriously they're trying to organize, but that's what they were saying. But most people are simply talking. So it's definitely a left problem as well. Am I right to hear that in what you're saying?
Yes, and I think that one of the consequences of this is that those groups that are very bent on acting necessarily become small and have a difficult time expanding because they're committed to something in particular that most of the other people will find various kinds of problems with. And so it becomes very difficult to have, the image that we have of the mass movement from the 20th century with the extraordinarily charismatic major historical figure leading, the Vladimir Lenin, the Mahatma Gandhi, the Martin Luther King, saying, here's what we ought to be doing, and very, very large numbers of people acting purely on the basis that this is someone they trust and this person has told them that this is the thing to do. This kind of thing never happens now. We don't have these kinds of people who are able to enjoy this level of respect or regard from this level of a variety of different places, different constituencies. Instead, at very, very early stages, things begin to fragment. And so some groups prioritize staying together and increasing the reach, which forces them to act less. And other groups prioritize the action, but that tends to cause them to become more niche and to have a kind of culty feel, to feel in some way cut off from the rest of society.
I have to say, and then I'm sure Spencer has something to add, but this is kind of the dilemma that we ourselves find ourselves in, right? We come from that Dorothy Day, Peter Maurin Catholic worker tradition, which has elements of, I guess, what would be perceived of as conservatism, but plenty of kind of radicalism, and was very active during the Great Depression, and then, still very active, but is kind of like you described, if you decide that you're going to do action, in this case, houses of hospitality for the homeless, Catholic worker farms, you're not going to have very much company. You have a lot of company that talks a lot, but not a whole lot of company that wants to come and work with you. So, I mean, your framework definitely is a framework for our experience as well. I mean, what would you say, Spencer?
Well, I would just ask, how do you account for, like, have we left the era of like the Lenins and the Gandhis because is it that the growth rates have decreased and we're living in a culture of narcissism with all its diminished expectations? Or were people in the past just less aware of themselves and all these idiosyncrasies, and they were more willing to be part of a homogenous mass movement?
So in each of my two books, I emphasize a different part of this. In Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, I emphasize that because major revolutionary change didn't happen in these very old liberal democracies, and by very old, I mean at least 100 years of having a liberal democratic set of procedures that you self-consciously frame as being liberal and democratic if you're the state. Countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, and a handful of other countries around the world with very, very old liberal democratic institutions by the standard of that type of regime. In those states, there is this loss of revolutionary possibility, I think, which allows the disagreements to become much more developed than they otherwise would be. So there is genuinely more disagreement, I think, among people than there was in the middle of the 20th century and earlier in countries like the US and UK. In addition to that, I do think there are things that have happened in the economy, and I talk about this more in The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut, which have tended to produce divergent experiences. For instance, since the 60s, the percentage of Americans who get a college degree has increased from around 5% to now it's up to around 40% of the US population has a college degree, and I think 60% of young people are going to college at this point. So one of the consequences of this is that we have very different socialization. We have a big chunk of people who have formative experiences in the university, and another big chunk of people still who do not have those experiences. And I think that this has made it more difficult for political movements to speak both to college-educated and non-college educated people. And I think oftentimes there's a tendency for movements to want to only have to talk to one type of person. And since we're now at a point where the percentages are 60-40 or closing in on 50-50, it will be extremely difficult to have a broad, very, very popular movement which is framing itself in terms that are catering either to college-educated workers or to non-college educated workers. There isn't a simple solution of picking one of these languages and rejecting the other. And yet a lot of groups, a lot of movements, I think, do want to be able to stick with one of these languages, with one of these ways of talking and framing and acting. and not the other. So I think that particularly in the States where there has been a big increase in the share of people who go to university, in those countries, I think that's been a major, major factor. Political parties are no longer able to talk to the whole population all at once. And then there are other things that exacerbate this in terms of the digital and the internet and the possibility of people to further develop idiosyncratic views that are different by finding like-minded people on the internet that they wouldn't be able to find in their own community and physical space. They wouldn't be able to make a group of friends and to sustain a formation around a particular way of thinking if they had to do it in physical space, but the internet facilitates that. But I don't like to overemphasize the internet because I do think there's a tendency sometimes to use criticism of the internet as a way of avoiding talking about these other bigger things that we would be dealing with in any case.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it seems like, I mean, the impression that I get from your book is that this may be insurmountable. I also kind of heard you say that you don't really want to take a position in the book anyway on whether it should be insurmountable or whether you would like it to be surmounted somehow, because you're mainly just trying to describe and explain why we're in the state we're in. But could you maybe speak to whether under any circumstances, this chronic crisis of legitimacy could be overcome and what it would take to do so, and whether you would want that to happen if it could happen?
Yeah, in this particular book, I am especially keen to try to analyze it without focusing too much on what I want. I notice that a lot of political theorists, if they focus too much on what they want or what they think, it tends to affect everything. Their analysis becomes trying to interpret how what they'd like to see happen could actually happen. If you start from what you want, you tend to get very far away from what's going on, especially in a context where there's so much disagreement. It would be very difficult for anyone to get precisely what they want. So that's why in this book in particular, I tend to be reluctant to get into me and what I would like to see. But I do think there are some possible ways that it could shake out. So one would be that at some point there is another kind of regime that people think of that does genuinely produce that kind of revolutionary commitment. I have a hard time seeing that happening from here. I look at the different things that have been proposed in recent years, and I don't see them catching in that kind of way. Certainly, we could point to individuals, small numbers of people, or some groups that are committed to different kinds of alternative models, but I don't really see those people in those models developing a broad social base in the liberal democracies at this particular point. Another possibility is that people could become exhausted with the critique, and they could just come to reframe all of this as inconveniences that have to be accepted as part of a new normal. I think that's more likely than the rise of a new alternative model. I think this is definitely one of the ways it could go. I am very keen to pay attention to what's going on with the Zoomer generation and the way the Zoomer generation talks about some of the things that have happened post-2008 or post the 70s that older generations have a tendency to problematize and treat as problems that we should work on. But I've noticed in the Zoomer media are more often treated as just part of life and part of what you have to deal with. And that is a significant change, which if it continues and develops, could eventually produce a very different kind of society where things that would not be acceptable to us would subsequently become acceptable in 50 or 60 years' time. That's another way it could go. Another possibility is that we could have a kind of a deliberate or purposeful shift in the way that we talk about things. A lot of academics try to formulate their views about what should make the state legitimate, and then they try to persuade the public of those positions. And they think of the university as upstream from the public. They think that they can constitute subjects through the university system who will have the values that they have or who will view the problems in the ways that they view it I don't think that that is likely to work because of this problem of what I call in the book the abstraction access issue, which is that many people still do not go to college. And if they are going to university, they are not interested in taking the courses where that kind of stuff goes on. And I think a lot of that stuff has, at this point, actively alienated a very large part of the population. So I don't really see much legs in that. I also think that there's very clearly huge disagreements, even among the academics themselves, about how to formulate their narratives. And conferences which just become talking shops where academics litigate very small differences about narratives, which I think is indicative that deep pluralism exists even within what sometimes from the outside looks like monolithic institutions which have singular views. I think there's a lot more disagreement even among academics or within what we might think of as elites than the public generally is aware of. And then I think there's also a possibility of what I call the despair democracy, a democracy that kind of runs on despair. So in this situation, it's not so much that people have treated the situation as a new normal, but they have treated their powerlessness in the face of it as a new normal. So they still recognize that the situation is in various ways unacceptable, but rather than normalize it or participate in it, they look for various ways to not be involved with it. And I am seeing this particularly with millennials. I think this is very much the way that the millennial generation is responding to this, with an attempt to go into what I call the enclaves, these enclavist zones where you can get out of politics and maybe realize some of your political values that you don't think can be realized through political action in some smaller setting, which can be what I call the four F's: faith, family, fandoms, and futurism, these kind of spaces that I see especially millennials going into. Some of them are coming back into church. Some of them are trying to make a household that operates on their values. Some of them are looking to entertainment companies to produce media that reflects their values. And some of them are getting very involved in technology, in trying to accelerate in some way a technological solution to the situation as they understand it. And I think that each of these things looks like a way out of politics, but can be repoliticized in various ways. And so in the despair democracy, there's an attempt by people to get out of politics, and then there's an attempt by politics to find them in the places where they're trying to hide from it. And I think for a lot of people, this is how politics is increasingly experienced. And if I had to say which way I think it goes, this is the one that sticks out to me as the most likely. But of course, I'm a millennial. So, and I do think that the millennial generation is the generation that is most like this. So it would make sense that to me, this would seem to be where it would be going. But in this direction, people try to get out of politics and then it finds them and it finds ways to drag them back into it. If you want to have the kind of family that you want to have, you need certain kinds of social support to make that family possible. And this becomes the basis for being brought back into politics on the basis of how do you get the resources that you need to support the kind of family structure you want to have. If you're trying to engage in church, there will be an attempt by professionals who want to have influence to get into your church and to try to use your church as a vector for getting you to engage in politics in the way that they think that you should. When you're involved in fandoms, when you're involved in these futurist projects, all of these political debates come up. The people who are involved in the H-1B debate recently about technology and about computer science and how to do all of this engineering. For them, there are all sorts of political questions that are raised in the course of trying to pursue their vision for the future. And these tech oligarchs who used to frame themselves as very much non-political, as not interested in politics, have all in various ways been dragged back into politics, and not just a little bit, but to the point of becoming very directly involved, in the case of Elon Musk, with the new administration. The debates about the Disney Corporation and the kind of media it produces, it's no longer just a question of are these movies art or are they fun? It's now a question of are they political? Are they inspiring political action? Are they themselves political acts? And this conversation about the politics of the movies has very much crowded a lot of the things that people who value this stuff used to go to this stuff for, producing deep tensions within fandoms and fan communities online. So I think it's become very acrimonious, but it's no longer a directly political acrimony. And I think that it now is this attempt to drag people into politics against their will, to make people participate in democracy when they don't want to.
I know I wanted to ask you about federalism, but before I do, I got to say, like, that also it sounds so familiar because I often feel like our society has become it's like hyper political. It's unnaturally political. Like, I imagine in previous times, people would, think politically when they needed to. And then most of the time they would just go about their business. But now politics, in one way, it kind of looms large, like as you've been describing, people arguing constantly. So politics, it's like everybody's become a very, an armchair political theorist of some kind, and that's an unnatural, strange situation. And I guess one of the ways this can turn, which is sort of adjacent to the millennial strategy that you were talking about, is the building of enclaves based on, in the case of the United States, the fact that we have these states that have quite a bit of autonomy and can fight for more within the federal system. And you see some evidence that people are starting to shift and change in their location to create a kind of, so one of the things we talked about on this podcast is neo-feudalism. And so it's kind of adjacent to that as well. People they want to move to where they will feel comfortable and where their voice can be heard and where they won't get as much disagreement. So I wanted to ask you if our country having this federal system might give people partly a way out of this, and just how you see that dynamic.
So I think that one of the things that is going on is that people are experiencing that we run up against the need to compete in a competitive global economy. And this need to compete compels a lot of different countries and different US states to have similar policy in lots of areas where people might want the policy to differentiate. And so one of the things that this has meant in practice is that it's just not possible for states to have much higher tax rates than the other states that they compete with without losing a lot of business activity, right? And this limits the degree to which the states can differentiate. They can't have Scandinavian-style tax rates and implement Scandinavian-style social programs because they're in a federal union where they have to have free movement and free trade with, say, Texas. And conversely, these states are limited in their ability to, deregulate or to, very much reduce tax rates by the fact of the federal tax rates, the fact of the federal regulations. These things in various ways also constrain states in their ability to economically liberalize in the old sense. So I think that part of the trouble is that there are these competitive dynamics that don't fall under the purview of any particular government, but which increasingly are compelling more and more governments, not just within the United States, but around the world, to make more and more similar policy. And one of the things this has produced is a desire for more national differentiation. I think we're seeing a lot of this lately on both the left and the right, a kind of demand on the left for a sort of a return to a third worldism or a second world politics of a kind of BRICS cohort of states, an interest in what China is doing or in the possibility of China leading some other coalition of states. And then within the right, this emphasis on trying to restore national powers to particular European states or to particular US states to restore a kind of sovereignty. The difficulty is this question about trade and the competitive dynamics that the trade kicks up and the potential inflation or instability that could be generated by an attempt to really reshape the trade relationship. And so all of these projects run up against the trade question. And I think that there has been a deep reluctance, even on the part of those who are most associated with revising these relationships to actually pull the trigger and make major, massive disruptions to global trade. In the case of, say, Trump and the trade war with China, between 2016 and 2020, I think goods imports from China fell 6% through that whole period. And they rose, I think, 88% in Vietnam. This is a stat that was in my first book, which is why it's stuck in my head. And what stood out to me about that is that all of these attempts to change the trade relationships, oftentimes they friend-shored rather than reshored jobs in manufacturing. So they changed which states we traded with as opposed to reducing the total amount of trade. And even in terms of changing which states we trade with, there wasn't a huge reduction in trade with China. It wasn't as if the two economies were decoupled and China became, similar to the Soviet Union in the Cold War, a state that we only very rarely trade with or interact with. That didn't happen. And then during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration was inclined to relax that trade policy so as to avoid furthering economic disruption during that year out of concern for the next election. And I think this is how governments are tending to think about the trade question. As soon as it becomes a question of inflation or shortages of particular things as the supply chains are redrawn, there's enormous, enormous concern about what the electoral implications of that will be. So even though a lot of people say in principle that they would like to have this greater level of autonomy, there's this question about whether they're willing to deal with the adjustment costs of redrawing that whole system and that whole network. And so far, even in states that have quite nationalist governments, say Hungary with Viktor Orban, trade is the one thing that never gets really, really changed. And so as I'm looking around at these proposals, I'm going, well, but what is going to happen with movement and trade? And that's where we tend to see the limits of these proposals.
You sound a little bit like Francis Fukuyama. I don't know if you like it or not, but but the difference would be, I think there was, in that very optimistic view, to a certain extent, there was this notion that with the interdependent trade relations, that you would eventually, the world would basically succumb to a peaceful and bland, governance of liberal democracy. So obviously you're not saying that. I mean, what kind of looms in the background in my imagination is American decline, or the decline of the West, more, because one way to look at this malaise that you're talking about is as decline and corruption, and of other countries that are fully engaged in trade but still aren't our friends, just deciding to take advantage of that and ending our particular regime for, because we have no real ability to make a concerted effort to stop them. We almost seem to be paralyzed in some ways. And so, I don't know, what do you say to that? Because my mind just kept coming up with objections because I don't want to believe this is our future.
No, it is a very, very dark kind of view, because I don't have the kind of optimism that someone like a Fukuyama would have. That is true. I think that this is, I kind of syncretize some of the liberal realist views that come from people like Fukuyama with some of the more critical perspectives. I think that this is a very difficult system to change or to disrupt, but I also think it's very unpleasant for people and genuinely immiserating. But I don't think that immiseration necessarily generates a capacity to change it. And that's where my view starts to get especially bleak. This idea that people could become more and more miserable, but that would not give them a capacity to change things. And so I think the advantage and disadvantage of these embedded liberal democracies is this lack of revolution. The lack of revolution means a lot of stability, and that you could go through enormously unpleasant things, and the political system can survive those things and remain intact. The disadvantage is that because there isn't concern that the state will fall, because this concern is ultimately really just something that we use to prevent change from occurring, very, very little change happens and we become much less adaptable in terms of what we can actually do about the concrete problems that we face. Other states around the world that don't have liberal democratic institutions or don't have embedded democracies, they have younger democracies that still perceive a genuine threat from the population. In those kinds of countries, many of the same problems are still faced. And I think many of the problems are quite serious and difficult to deal with. But the government has a sense that it could actually fall if it doesn't solve those problems. And therefore, the government has to try more things and to be more proactive. Now, depending on how serious the problems are, that could be better or worse than the situation in the embedded liberal democracies. A state like China could, by trying different things to avoid an internal disruption, find things that work. Or if the problems are very serious and intractable, it could fail to find things that work and eventually succumb to the crisis in a way that the liberal democracies of the West would not. But that doesn't mean that the liberal democracies of the West would have solved the problem or would have performed well. It would just mean that the kind of crisis that exists in those states isn't one that terminates in the fall of the regime. And I think this could be even an interesting way to think about the fall of the Soviet Union versus the United States coming out of the 70s. I think in part because the Soviet Union collapsed, there's a sense that the United States solved the crisis of the 70s. But we might still be in a very, very long version of that. And it might just be the case that the Soviet institutions were more brittle, ultimately. They couldn't find a solution to that crisis and therefore fell, whereas our institutions were able to kick along with various dissatisfying solutions that didn't stick for any great length of time and couldn't ultimately solve the deeper problems coming out of the process of globalization that kicked off immediately following World War II.
So I know you don't like telling people what to do, and you didn't put your diatribe at the front, but I guess I'm curious, given this general bleakness, like what at least do you do to find meaning and try and act as ethically as possible given all of the constraints we're submerged in?
Yeah, in my own case, I like to make a distinction between a negative despair and a positive despair. A negative despair, you look at a situation, you aren't able to find something straightforward to do about it, and you start blaming yourself and the people around you, or different groups of people that you've been made aware of for that situation. And so it turns into a kind of very, very negative thing where this very difficult problem is being concretized in others. And you're saying, they're the problem, or I'm the problem. And that kind of self-hatred or hatred of other people can eat away at you and cause serious problems. It can lead to alcoholism, it can lead to drug abuse, it can lead to overeating, it can lead to all kinds of very, very bad things. But I do think that there's a more positive kind of despair where looking very honestly at the situation, if you don't blame yourself and other people for it, can allow you to clear away things that you otherwise might have been caught up in doing that wouldn't have worked or wouldn't have been effective and would have been a waste of time. And what that, I think, allows is for me to take a kind of close continuing look at what's going on and to try to see it very, very clearly, unclouded by my desire to have a straightforward solution to it. And this allows me to keep engaging with it and to stay with it over a long period of time rather than getting upset with myself or with other people and then having that upset be the thing that drives me. But it's not an easy thing to do. It requires always refusing these opportunities that you have to blame yourself or blame other people for the way that it is. You have to have some kind of theory, some kind of belief in something that enables you to not make it about judging yourself or others for the situation. And if you can avoid judging yourself or other people, then you can keep looking at it. But to do that, you have to say, well, you have to resist this urge to go, well, somebody has to be the problem. It can't be somebody. It's got to be a complicated structural thing that we just have to try to understand a little better. And to stick with it and keep trying to understand it, for me.
Yeah. Especially for people who are publicly engaged, and consider themselves to be educators of some sort, right? And to ask, why am I doing this? It's something that I ask, and I'm sure Spencer and you both do as well, almost every day. Exactly what is the purpose, right? And that's not a bad way to look at it. At the very least, helping people understand the circumstances that they're in so that they can make better choices is certainly not nothing and worth doing. I wanted to ask you about just the fact that Donald Trump got reelected, and how that fits in, because it's you finalized this book, I think, before you would have possibly known that was going to happen. And I think for a lot of people who voted for him, that they were thinking that they were going to get some real, deep change, that they were going to get rid of the deep state, because they do have this sense that there's like a very, very large kind of impenetrable apparatus that's kind of holding everything up somehow, right? And that's been a focus, right? He didn't do that the first time around, but I think people still vote for him with the notion that they are going to get something big and different. And he presents himself that way. It maybe, seems kind of superficial to me and kind of bombastic and so on, but he definitely, that's what he promises, and people voted for him. So how do you see like Trump and just the emergence of this type of leader, not just here, but around the world, of populist, demagogic leaders, left and right, I guess, but particularly Trump?
I think one of the things that really stood out about this election is the framing of this as a great landslide victory. And yet, in terms of the numbers in the legislature for the Republican Party, it's an extremely narrow majority from a legislative standpoint. And that, I think, has increasingly become the norm. For one, presidents just operate now at levels of approval that would have been considered terrible to have in the 20th century. It's become normal for presidents to just go through their whole term at something like 40, 42, 44% approval, and to never even go above 50 for any great length of time. And then to have these much smaller congressional majorities, even in the first 2 years, which is the period where typically you see the best numbers, even then to have these very, very narrow majorities, and then to immediately get into these cases where you have 3 to 5 people in the House or in the Senate that potentially hold up everything that you do, and some unknown number of additional people who would hold up things that you were doing if they had to, but can pretend that they support you because they know that those 3 to 5 people exist who are willing to oppose you publicly. This, I think, has become just ubiquitous. Nobody seems to be able to break through this. Right now in the UK, all of the major party leaders for all of the parties have approval net ratings of -30 to -40 points. That includes the Prime Minister, Starmer, as well as the leader of the Conservative Party and the leader of the Reform Party, which sprouted up as a potential alternative to the two parties. So in that case, even though people are very, very dissatisfied with the government, they aren't even drawn on an electoral level to the opposition party, let alone to something else beyond that. So I think that while there will be a significant constituency of people that will be persuaded by any one of these figures, I don't think these figures command the kind of support base that they would need to even move a lot of legislation, much less potentially change the fundamental character of the political system. And that is the thing that I think is so distinctively 21st century and embedded democracy about these countries.
Do you think they would if they could? You know, in other words, like if they had somehow had a larger majority, that they would institute more fundamental changes, and they just can't. You know, or some people say, oh, they full of shit. Basically, they would never do that. They're just talking a good line, right? But they're just as kind of I don't know, institutionally embedded as anybody else. I mean, how do you see these people? Do you see them as potentially a revolutionary force? It's just never going to be big enough.
There may be some that, if they could, would. The recent events in South Korea are, I think, very interesting in this regard. There you had a leader who was willing to try to declare martial law and make himself the ruler of the country. And he tried to do it and then found that he could not do that at all, that many other parts of the state immediately responded to that with a certain level of hostility. That there's this great video of these soldiers coming to the parliament building to stop the parliament from meeting, which is technically against the Korean constitution, and these journalists with cameras photographing them. And the soldiers, in response to the photographs, stop running toward the building and back off. They were intimidated by a bunch of people with cameras. They were not willing to, because they knew that if in front of all of these people with cameras they used force, that this would only further undermine their ability to actually do what they were looking to do, and that very likely they would then go to prison, or there could be a civil conflict or something, that it would escalate in such a way that it wouldn't possibly be worth it to them. It didn't even require anybody with a gun. And this is a country, South Korea is not a country with a deeply embedded democracy. It's a country that had a dictatorship 40 years ago, where many of the presidents have either gone to prison or they have put other former presidents in prison. And yet, even in that country, a leader trying to declare martial law with the support of a significant part of the military was not able to do that. So I don't know for sure about the psychology of people like Trump or people like, say, Boris Johnson in the UK, who at one point prorogued Parliament. I don't know, ultimately, if they would, if they could. Someone like J.D. Vance is often accused of wanting to, on the basis of his connections or people he knows or talks to. But I'm not sure it matters. I'm not sure it matters what they want to do.
That's hopeful in a strange sort of way. I'm not sure. Anyway, I want to make sure, Spencer, I know you probably have to go pretty soon. Do you have anything else you want to ask?
No, I think I'd cede the final question to you.
The final question. Do you want to give us your diatribe now? Because Spencer didn't, and I would agree, like I didn't quite hear, like what, yeah, and it doesn't even have to be on the topic that we've been discussing. Like what gets you excited and what drives you? Yeah, give us your personal diatribe. What do you want to talk about?
I think at a personal level, the thing that stood out to me is, I went to a high school in Indiana with a bunch of regular Indiana people. I didn't go to one of these prep schools. I wasn't in a lot of the kinds of institutions that I realized when I went to university were normal for people who went to places like Cambridge. And what I have seen over the years is that so many of these people worked very, very hard and did what they were asked to do and have not gotten the things that they were told that they would get in return. I know so many people who aren't able to get a house, or they're not able to have kids, or they're not able to raise their own children or spend time with their kids because they're in a situation where both parents have to work. And people with enormous amounts of student debt, medical debt, not working in their preferred field, not doing what they want to do. And these people, they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't done anything wrong, but people are always telling them that it's their fault. And that if they could just be tougher or do better or learn to code or whatever it might be, that they would then get all of these things. that they were promised. And for me, a lot of my work is ultimately for them. It's for the people who are not getting the things that they were promised, and who want to know why, and who are constantly being told that the reason why is their fault or somebody else's fault, that they should hate themselves or they should hate some other group of people. And I want to figure out what the real reason is that they're not getting what they want. And even if we can never figure out a way to give them the things that they were promised or help them give themselves the things that they were promised, if we could all understand why we're in this mess, that would be something.
Well said. I think we're united on that. Yeah, definitely. Well, we want to thank you very much for coming. And we also want to note you're coming back in March to give a talk on your book, on the subject of your book, or if things change, whatever it is that you do want to talk about. We're really excited to have you and looking forward to it. We'll put out more information about that as we get closer to the event, but really appreciate your time today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.